through. So welcome Pacific Club. This is a distinguished speakers event, and pleased to have everybody on board. After speaker right now, we're trying to figure out where he is at this point. Our speaker today is going to be a retired Navy captain and Bud Cole. Dr. Bernard Cole is also a professor at the National Defense University. He last spoke with us on May 4th, 2016. We were live that day. Cynthia Watson was here, and Bud gave some comments during that presentation. His topic today is going to be the South China Sea, strategic perspective and military modernization. It's certainly a timely topic as we watch the political conventions, and China has continuing a high-profile role in the comments that are being made. So Mr. Curry will introduce Dr. Cole if we get him on the right link here a little bit later.
I think I'm on now.
In just a few minutes. Okay, good. Welcome. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry about the initial confusion there.
Yeah, good. Dr. Cole, it's good to have you with us. I just have welcomed you and explained that this speakers event and that you spoke here 4 years ago. So with Cynthia Watson. So we'll have no pledge today, but I've asked Joe Stapleton to give us some words of inspiration given our topic today. I would point out that Joe is a bit of a celebrity today. He was just named Newport Beach Citizen of the Year, which is quite an honor, and I'm pleased to welcome Joe to give us some words of inspiration. Joe Stapleton.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. So as we move closer to the November 3rd election, now incredibly only 78 days away, China is certainly front and center as a key point of discussion for how the U.S. can best handle this behemoth. The Pacific Club and DOCA are fortunate to have one of our nation's experts on China discuss today's subject. Our speaker has qualifying credentials for today's talk. Certainly first being that he's a retired Navy captain, and second, expert on China from our nation's top defense university. So now we're all looking forward to hearing his comments and insights, and may the U.S. remain the dominant power that it is. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. I would like to say a few words about DOCA, who's also co-sponsoring today's event. DOCA is an organization that stands for Defense Orientation Conference Association, about 250 men and women nationwide. They have a keen interest in national defense and affairs of state, sanctioned by the Department of Defense and the Department of State Department. In a non-COVID year, they take about 5 trips to 2 international, 3 domestic.
First of all, let me welcome my DOCA members and my members of the Pacific Club to what I think is going to be a fascinating talk. I met Dr. Cole several years ago. He not only spoke briefly at the Pacific Club, but he also spoke to us when we were at the National Defense University in Washington 3 or 4 years ago. He's married to one of my favorite people, Cynthia Watson, who has spoken to us several times, both with us on trips and at the Pacific Club. Anyway, most of you have probably read his background, a UNC graduate, NROTC, 30 years in the United States Navy, commander and commodore of destroyer squadrons and a destroyer ship, fought at Khe Sanh in Vietnam, and then went back and decided they were coming on as academic, and is one of the country's top experts in the subject of South China Sea and China in general. I will take no more time other than to thank him for taking time and being with us today. Dr. Cole, it's yours.
Bob, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be back speaking to this group again, also the DOCA members. I'm going to put a bunch of slides up here. Here we go. And one of the things that always annoys me the most is when somebody puts up a bunch of slides and then reads them to the audience. So I'm certainly not going to do that. The very first lecture I gave at the National War College back in 1994 was the worst lecture, 93, the worst lecture I've ever given in my life. And afterwards, I was talking to one of the old hands there, and he said, no, he said, don't try to script everything you say. Just put up some slides as prompters for your remarks. And that's what I'll do today. I do want to point out on this first slide that the focus today is going to be the South China Sea, but it's almost impossible to talk about just the South China Sea without mentioning some of these other topics. I'll also note two disclaimers. The one up there that, you know, at my age, I really don't care if I represent anybody else's views, but I do have to put that up since I have served in the Navy and for the National Defense University, and now am a senior fellow at the Center for Naval Analysis, where I just kind of help out on the projects that CNA does for various clients concerning the Chinese Navy. The other disclaimer I always give when I talk about China is that I'm not Chinese. And what I've learned from reading and studying and from many visits to China since January 1993, I think was my first one. And in addition to that, I've also talked to a lot of Chinese interlocutors, both in this country and in China. And I will tell one little sea story here is in 2015-16, before President Trump was elected, the Chinese delegations to Washington that I would interact with always wanted to know, well, who's going to win the election, or who's going to win the nomination? And the common response from myself and my colleagues, well, it certainly won't be Donald Trump. And then after he was nominated, the question was, who do you think is going to win? And they generally received the same answer, but the common Chinese response was they hoped that Donald Trump would win the presidency because, quote, he was a businessman and they knew how businessmen thought. After about after the summer of 2017, after President Trump had been in office for a while, the question from our Chinese interlocutors was always, what is he doing and why is he doing it? And I think that wonder has sort of continued. I'll mention some of the effects of current U.S. policies as we go through this today's events. I also want to note that three of the most important factors when we discuss the South China Sea are nationalism, Chinese and other nations, other claimant nations' nationalism. The unique role, I think, in China of the Chinese Communist Party. There's a similar role in Vietnam and the Vietnamese Communist Party, but nothing like the CCP in China. And finally, I do want to talk a bit about the military modernization that China is going on right now. I first learned about this in the I guess it was the fall of 2013. At NDU, we hosted one of the military region commanders, a lieutenant general from the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. And he indicated then that there was going to be a big reorganization coming, and that the winners of the reorganization were going to be the Navy and the Air Force, and the loser was going to be the Army. And I'm not sure that if winners and losers are the correct phrases, but I think he was accurate in his forecast. I'll talk a bit about that later on. Just a map to remind us that China is, people talk about China dominating Asia. Well, of course, geographically, China is most of Asia. And if we look around China's borders, even though China, I guess since about 2000, has formally resolved every border dispute it's had, except with India. Let me note that there are still border disputes with India and Bhutan. There's the issues of Taiwan, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, even the Yellow Sea. There's a small sovereignty dispute with both Koreas. There's a dispute with North Korea on the North Korea-Chinese border, who owns this particular mountain, and South Korea and North Korea agree on that. The border between China and Vietnam remains, I guess, tender is the best idea. Chinese forces regularly go into Burma, cross the border illegally to take care of terrorists and drug smugglers and so forth. Interestingly enough, most of the drug smugglers in northern Burma, the so-called Golden Triangle, are former nationalist Chinese troops who in 1948, as they were losing, sought haven in the nearest place to them, which for many of them was in Burma. And so we owe the sort of the flourishing of the Golden Triangle in large part to these former nationalist Chinese troops. Let's see, I think that's about it. I also note that in 1964, this is one of my favorite little factoids, Mao Zedong, who was then the ruler of China, gave an interview with a Czechoslovak newspaper, and he was talking about what the Chinese call unequal treaties. That is, treaties that the Chinese were forced to sign primarily during the 18th and 19th century, giving up territory or granting unfair advantages to foreign nations. Well, one of them was I think it was 1666, a treaty between Tsarist Russia and Imperial China, which basically gave up a good portion of what is today maritime Russia, but in those days was considered Chinese territory. I always like to ask my Chinese interlocutors, how come they don't include that Russian treaty as an unequal treaty? And they always slough off the answer, because right now, of course, China and Russia have a very strong, even a strategic relationship. I'll also note one other territorial issue, not really territorial, but I think important in the international context, and that is the Arctic. We've all read about the reduction in the ice coverage in the Arctic and how we now have merchant ships, primarily tankers, specifically built for Arctic waters, going back and forth between the Pacific and the Atlantic. China is a big player in this, although I have to note that according to International Maritime Organization, relatively very few cargoes have actually been able to make this transit because it's just not economical. Nonetheless, China has declared itself a, quote, near Arctic nation. Now, the Arctic Council, of course, consists of the United States and Russia and Canada and Norway and Sweden, the other nations that border on the Arctic. And the Arctic Council, for reasons unknown to me, decided to grant China, and I think maybe Japan, I'm not sure about that, this status as a, quote, near Arctic nation, which gives China the right to take a seat at some of these meetings. I can't emphasize enough that when the president of China, no matter who he is, wakes up in the morning and wonders what's happening, the first thing he thinks about, I'm sure, is not the United States or Taiwan or Japan, but rather it's how many incidents of social unrest have occurred in my country. In other words, the burden of governing, keeping the Chinese Communist Party in power. Domestic issues are dominant, and I'll talk more about some of the ones like trade and the water shortage, and ironically, both the water shortage and the danger of floods right now that concerns Beijing. But I think the most important bullet on this slide is that third one down. No major continental power, I think, in history has ever succeeded in simultaneously or concurrently becoming a maritime power. The United States stands almost alone in that respect. And of course, the United States is unique with the major oceans on both coasts. Main China couldn't do it. France, Germany, USSR, nobody has made that transition. China came close in the early 16th century when Zheng He, a Ming explorer, made some voyages at least into the Persian Gulf and the east coast of Africa, but it didn't last, and it was really just more pirate expeditions than anything else. So if China can pull this off, it'll be very significant. Right now, I'm not sure they even have that ambition. They certainly say they don't, but of course, you have to take everything. I'm sorry about that. Let me turn that off. I should have done that earlier. China has not been able to make that transition yet, but they seem to be working on it. The other bullet on that slide, I've lost the slide here. Let me see. The 100 years of humiliation. This refers to the period from about 1840 to 1949 when China was, in Mao Zedong's phrase, a semi-colony. And this is when many foreign nations had the right of extraterritoriality, meaning that their citizens could not be tried in a Chinese court, and the foreign nations had all sorts of extra privileges. The final bullet on there, the use of military power, I think is significant because China has never hesitated since 1949 to employ military power as an instrument of statecraft. That's a phrase we like to use at the National War College. what's important to me, I think, is not only have they used military force, for instance, in all the Taiwan Straits crises between 1949 and 1996, but after researching that issue for one of my books, I'm convinced that in every one of those cases in the Taiwan Strait, Beijing has miscalculated what the American response would be. And I think that's very dangerous. China's strategic goals. That first goal is very important. And this also goes to a subsidiary point that I never hesitate to make. When an officer is commissioned in the People's Liberation Army, he doesn't swear allegiance to China or the president of China. He swears allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party. And this means to me, and I've for many, many years now, I've told my students and audiences that in a given crisis involving, say, the United States and China, US policymakers are liable to say, well, here's this crisis. We've analyzed it, it's important, but it's not going to demand military action by either side. Well, that's from our perspective. From the Chinese perspective, if the Chinese Communist Party thinks that its legitimacy is threatened, it will use military action to prove its legitimacy. They've done this against India in 1962, against Vietnam in 1979. It's called, quote, teaching a lesson, unquote. If you talk to a Chinese historian and you say, how can you justify that, or how can you say that the military campaign into Vietnam in 1979 was a victory when it was tactically and operationally, it was a shambles for the PLA? And the answer always is, well, we taught Hanoi a lesson. That's kind of hard for an American to process a lot of times. But it's very important, I think, for American policymakers to understand that the rationale for China using military force may not be the same as ours, especially now that they are modernizing their military so much. I mean, the military in Korea was, a bunch of guys with rifles, semi-trained, charging fixed positions. We're not talking about that kind of Chinese military anymore. China wants to be the determinant power in East Asia. The way I usually phrase this, especially from a maritime perspective, is that China doesn't want events occurring, certainly within the first or even second island chain in the Western Pacific, of which they do not approve. I'm not sure if this is the same as hegemony or not, because I'm not sure how to define hegemony, but China definitely wants to have a vote in everything that happens, probably west of Hawaii eventually. And they have made this proposition in a semi-joking fashion at the presidential level to the last several US presidents. And China wants to be a world power. Now, by that, this goes directly to the Chinese demand for respect. They're the world's second largest economy. They may soon be the largest economy. They're the world's second largest military. Culturally, they're huge. There's this huge diaspora of Chinese ethnically around the world. They feel that they should have the respect of a world power, and they feel they don't often get it. There's a large element of paranoia, in my view, in the Chinese perspective on the rest of the world. Let me also go back to that thriving economy just for a moment. I listened to a presentation yesterday from The Economist magazine in which they were noting the terrible effects of the COVID-19 crisis. And most of them, I think every major economy in the world except China and Indonesia, was going to suffer a downturn in GDP this year and probably in 2021. China's economy, or GDP, which had been growing anywhere from 7% on up, depending on who you believe, was forecast to be 1.2% this year. So even for China, it's been a major hit. And as I mentioned, the statistics coming out of China are really shaky, even for the Chinese. Many years ago, when I was more active and I'd have lunch with the Chinese naval attaché in Washington 3 or 4 times a year, I was there one time talking to this senior captain, and we were chatting, and he said, "Where are you?" I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Shandong Province," which is known as the province of the generals in China, up in the northeastern part of China. And he said, my brother's mayor of the little village I came from. And I said, "Well, how big's the village?" And he said, it's about 11,000, but my brother reports a population of no more than 5 or 5,500. And I said, "Why?" And so the senior captain looked at me like I was a fool and said, well, because taxation is based on the numbers. So this way the village has to pay far less taxes to the central government. So even in Beijing, they have a shaky hold on their statistics, I think. Military and police capability, that's really one line, because reliable sources estimate that the internal security budget in China is significantly more than the quote military budget unquote is. They're a hell of a lot more worried about internal security, as I mentioned earlier, than they are about the foreign military. What do they envision for their military? Well, one way to judge the seriousness of a domestic incident, say in Tibet or Xinjiang province out west, where they're beating up on the Uyghurs, is if the local police handle it, it's pretty routine. If the People's Armed Police, which is I used to say it was a semi-military organization, but it's not now. Since the reorganization in 2015, the People's Armed Police, or the PAP, is a totally militarized organization, works directly for the Central Military Commission in Beijing. If the PAP handles it, it's more serious, but local. But if they call in the military, then it's considered a very major incident. China is very concerned about deterrence, both nuclear and conventional. And as I mentioned earlier, sovereignty is really a very major issue. Chinese government concerns, you see that one? Okay, thank you. I've gone over most of this. It's pretty self-evident. Let me look at the second bullet for a minute. I mentioned the effects of COVID. Lots of people are blaming the Chinese for COVID. They mishandled it in December and January, December 2019 and January 2020. Evidence is that the local authorities in Wuhan and central China deliberately misled the leadership in Beijing. Nothing new about that. Same thing happened in 2008 when there was terrible earthquakes in Sichuan province. I've only been to Wuhan once or twice, by the way, and even before COVID, it was a miserable place, terrible pollution, both air and water. But there's no doubt that China mishandled it. Of course, the Chinese then turn to us and say, well, you didn't handle it very well in January and February either. And it's hard to argue against that. Flooding. Right now, there's very serious flooding, particularly along the upper Yangtze River. The Yangtze River, of course, is the extremely long river, goes right through the middle of China. The Chinese define North China as above the Yangtze and South China as below the Yangtze. When I visited there, the first January I was in China, we were in Nanjing, which is south, just on the southern border, southern edge of the Yangtze River, and there was no heat. And when we asked our hosts how come there's no heat in our rooms, they said, well, we're in South China, so we don't need heat, which is kind of a strange answer. That same visit, I was with an Army Lieutenant General who was an engineer, Lieutenant General Paul Surgeon, and we visited what in those days was this huge mock-up of what the Three Gorges Dam was going to look like on the upper reaches of the Yangtze River. And we spent about 2 hours there, and General Surgeon, who was a professional civil engineer, asked lots of questions, and his comment on the ride back to the hotel was, they don't have any idea what they're doing. And there's lots of questions unanswered about the effects of that huge dam. And right now, the Chinese are extremely worried about the effects of the flood waters that are building up behind the dam. Reminds me of that old margarine nation advertisement many decades ago. It's not nice to fool with Mother Nature. And the Chinese may have done that too much. Food is also a problem. China cannot feed itself. China is about the same size as the United States, but it's got 4 times the population. Think about Wyoming being overpopulated, for instance. 4 times the population, 1/3 the arable land, and maybe 13% of the potable water. So the guys in Beijing have a real challenge just on sort of a day-to-day basis. The only piece, or the first peaceful change of government in Beijing was 1992. And China likes to date its existence back about 5,000 years. That's probably 2,000 years gratuitous, but still it's a long time. So think about that. The first peaceful change of government was 1992. And everyone since then has been full of political strife and stuff, makes our current elections look very mild. But every violent change of government has been characterized by corruption. I want to turn back to that a minute. Some sort of religious or ethnic conflict, and military uprising or some sort of civil uprising. And if we think about today, what worries Beijing is they've got the trade problems, they've got internal economic problems, they've got the religious problem with the Muslims that they're being very draconian about. So they've got lots of concerns. The corruption I want to note is not the economic corruption that Xi Jinping, who's currently president of China, is really going after in a civil and military society, but what I term military corruption. And that is, if you have a military unit on an exercise, and then you go to evaluate the exercise guys are reporting their own activities, maybe there's outside evaluators and umpires judging it. Is that process honest or objective? And we read so much coming out of the headquarters of the military services, as well as the as well as the Chinese Military Commission, accusing people of cheating on their military exercises and concerned about it, that I think that sort of operational corruption, if you will, is still rampant in the People's Liberation Army. Now, I got this slide primarily from one of the most recent Chinese defense white papers. They put these out every 2 years. And every one of these, going back to 1998, has said China requires an international environment of global peace and stability, which is true. They don't want to be cut off from the world. And that's why they're very sensitive to the current tariff structure that our administration has put into effect. But I have to note, updated on the presentation I saw yesterday coming out of London, that in fact, no matter how unbalanced or balanced the US-China relationship is, China's international trade relationship is slightly against their favor, slightly out of balance against China. So they are a world trader. They don't have all their eggs in just the US basket. They do see problems, and they manage to blame all their problems on the United States, of course. These are some of the border areas I mentioned. Taiwan, of course, remains the #1 strategic concern for the People's Liberation Army. I'm convinced of that. I don't think China wants to use military force against Taiwan, but of course they have laid down certain red lines and they refuse to abandon the use of military force. Let me move on to the next slide, which talks about some of the military modernization. Note that I mentioned earlier the party army thing. The organization is probably the most important element of modernization. It started in 2015 formally, and the Chinese have announced it's going to end in 2020. No way. What China is really trying to do with its military is a combination of the US 1947 Defense Reorganization Act, 1956 Defense Reorganization Act, and Goldwater-Nichols. And Beijing is trying to implement that all in 5 years. I would argue that we still are fighting with Goldwater-Nichols. So it's going to take them a long time to do it. But they have made some very major steps, both in organization and in hardware. I will note that when I first visited China's National Defense University in January 1994, that I asked the senior colonel sitting across the table from me what China's major defense or military threats were. And he said, Japan #1, Russia #2, and India #3, or something like that. About 10 years later, when I asked him the same question, he said US #1, Japan #2, and India #3. By that point, of course, they were trying to be friends with Russia, so Russia was sort of blinked at. But I think they still are very concerned about Russia, just as despite Putin, I think Russia is still very concerned about China as one of the current threats. Please, let me talk about military modernization a bit. The Navy, of course, now has 2 aircraft carriers steaming around. They're probably going to have a total of 6. They've got some very modern Aegis-like guided missile destroyers. They've increased their amphibious force a bit, launching an LHD. There's a large helicopter carrier. But another significant element is the Marine Corps, which was up until a couple of years ago, a total of 12,000 people, 6,000 man independent brigades, although it had both women and men in it. That now it has multiplied by a factor of 5 or 6. So they've probably got 60 or 70,000 folks in their Marine Corps. And they are following our motto with the Marines in the sense that they're making them all the equivalent, theoretically, of special operating forces. Air Force is getting Generation 5 stealth aircraft. They're really struggling with that. For reasons I don't understand, China has yet to be able to indigenously develop and deploy reliable gas turbine engines, either for their ships or for their aircraft. They buy maritime gas turbines from the Ukraine and the aircraft engines from Russia still. We sold them 5 LM2500 GE gas turbines back in the 1980s, and they still have 4 of those steaming around. The Army, as I mentioned, is ranked 3 out of 3 in this scenario, but they are improving some of their artillery and tanks and some of those subsidiary or some of those forces. Strategic. One of the things they did when they reorganized is instead of everybody working for the Army, now the Army is just another service working for what they call the People's Liberation Army headquarters. But they also organized something called the Strategic Support Force. We're not real sure what that includes, but apparently a strategic support force in China, which is the smallest of the services, focuses on cyber and space, some of those things. Rocket force, very similar to the old Soviet rocket forces controlling missiles and nuclear weapons. I mentioned the People's Armed Police, so they usually spell it with an E. I see I dropped that off. One of the big changes during the reorganization is the Coast Guard now also comes under the military command rather than a civilian oceanic command. And they consolidated the chain of command. They now have a single PLA headquarters in Beijing, and they went from 7 or 8 military regions down to 5 theaters. And since one of those theaters basically is the capital region around Beijing, it's really 4 operational theaters and then the capital region. Next slide is a South China Sea chart, excuse me. And I show this because it shows the different claimants' claims in the South China Sea. You notice the red line, what we used to call the 10, the 11, and then the 9, and now it's the 10 dash line, really covers about 90% of the South China Sea. And Beijing has been very coy about defining really what that means. The standard line coming out of Beijing is, we claim all the land features in the South China Sea and associated waters. The devil's in the details because they never explain what they mean by associated waters. And I'll mention here in a minute the danger of that. Next slide is artificial islands. We've read a lot about China building these artificial islands. Taiwan, Vietnam, Republic of the Philippines, and Malaysia had already done this before China started in 2013. But those 4 nations, among them, probably built 10 or 20 acres of stuff. China has built over 3,200 acres of artificial islands or structures since 2013. Even though the International Court ruled in 2016 at the behest of the Philippines that there are no legal islands in the South China Sea. And that's important if you're looking at exclusive economic zones, contiguous zones, territorial waters, and so forth. Next slide. Fiery Cross Reef they have built 7 of these bases in the South China Sea. Fiery Cross Reef is one of the 3 biggest. If you overlay Fiery Cross Reef over Pearl Harbor, it dwarfs Pearl Harbor. Think about that. That's how big it is. And if you could read this, I'm not sure you can read this chart. I can't very well, but it shows the various weapons emplacements, places for aircraft and ships to dock and so forth. Most of these islands are not fully armed yet. The facilities are there, but the Chinese have not seen fit to permanently station forces. I still think that since none of these places have any native indigenous fresh water, I think the reason they don't keep aircraft there for more than a few days at a time is, as you guys are aviators know, you got to clean the engines. The salt air will tear those engines up, and you need a lot of fresh water to do that. Next slide is an important one because it shows the ranges of some of the systems that the Chinese have either installed or can install in short order, and they cover the entire South China Sea and, in fact, most of Southeast Asia. From a tactical military viewpoint, the Chinese already own the South China Sea. It's that straightforward. Now, let me back off a minute. I have participated in a lot of war games in the last several years through my association primarily with the Center for Naval Analysis, some unclassified, some classified. And in every case, the South China Sea does not turn out to be very important either to Washington or to Beijing. Beijing just has more important things to worry about, like Taiwan and Japan, and so does the US. So the South China Sea is important for sort of non-military reasons. I'll talk about that in just a second. But again, from a tactical, operational, military perspective, depending on what US forces we are willing to commit, China owns the South China Sea. Not legally, but from a military perspective. It's pretty sobering. Why is the South China Sea important? Well, trade, energy reserves, fisheries, national pride. I think that national pride is the most important factor for China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, all of whom have claims there. Brunei's claim is very small. Indonesia doesn't have a claim within the 9-dash line within the South China Sea per se, but it's extremely concerned, as you can imagine. One item there that always gets my attention is energy reserves. The Chinese National Overseas Oil Company came out with an estimate a few years ago and said they estimate 213 billion barrels of oil and 266 trillion square feet of natural gas in the South China Sea. International Energy Association, international organization, said, well, we think there's 11 barrels, not 213, 11 billion barrels, and 28 trillion square feet, not 266. Now, most of this refers to the central South China Sea because lots of nations are already recovering oil and natural gas from sort of the boundary areas of the South China Sea. And interestingly enough, one of the most productive of those areas up in a very northern part of the sea is a joint venture between, get this, Taiwan and China. So there's lots of energy in the South China Sea, but not nearly as much as some of the estimates would make you believe. I've gone a little bit longer than I wanted to. Let me stop there, and we'll go down and put this chart up, this last slide, and stand by for some of your questions or comments, or agree or disagree. Happy to entertain everything. Thank you.
So I've recently seen a presentation on Hong Kong and the impact of China's say rolling out and how it's going to affect Hong Kong. How important is Hong Kong in the overall equation? And is it strategic to China? Can they get by without it? What is your view on Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong reverted to China. The British-Chinese agreement took effect it was formed in 1992 and took effect in 1997. In May of 1996, I was in Hong Kong talking to a very well-connected American investor there. I won't mention his name, but he said, nothing bad's going to happen in Hong Kong from an economic perspective. But about that time, I also visited Shanghai that same month to talk to the American Chamber of Commerce there. And there's no question in their mind that Shanghai, under any circumstances, was going to outshine Hong Kong in terms of trade and banking and financing. I think that prognostication has proven to be true. I'm certainly not an economist, but Hong Kong remains a very flourishing, important financial center, but nowhere near as important as it was 50 years ago. And I think if from an economic perspective, Hong Kong is not as crucial as it was, it's still important, but it's not the end all and be all of China's trade centers. They're not going to cut off their nose to spite their face.
If you could redirect our U.S.-China policy, and President Trump were to call you and say, Dr. Cole, what is your opinion? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? Would you advise them stay the course, change the course? What would your advice be?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer because the last time I've been in China in about, let's see, 3 years now. But when I was in China before that one time, I think it was fall of 2014, I was presenting a paper at a conference in Shanghai, talking to this colonel in their army who just happened to show up every time I did. Nice guy, fluently. And at one point we were talking about the South China Sea, and he was giving me the party line. we're standing there with a cup of tea in our hands, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, this guy, they let him come down to Shanghai for a week from Beijing, and to pay them back, he has to give me the party line. But I would really be annoyed if he thought I believe it's BS. I don't care if I ever go back to China. The arrogance that really began emerging in 2008 when they decided we were rising and the U.S. was declining because of the economic crisis has only increased over time. As far as my advice would be concerned, I don't see the point in this, quote, trade war, unquote, because I don't think we're winning a damn thing by doing it. I'm not sure how paying trillions of dollars to American farmers is hurting China. But clearly, we have to take a stand on things like the South China Sea. We've taken a very good stand on the East China Sea, although that's more fragile, I think, than people realize for various reasons. But, when the International Court made that ruling in 2016 in favor of the Philippines, and China said, we're just going to ignore it, the U.S. really didn't do anything, and we should have. I mean, on a legal basis, we should have gone back on the basis of international law and just raised hell in whatever ways we could and try to engender more cooperation among the other South China Sea claimants. The only way to beat China in the South China Sea, and it may be too late now, would be to get all the other claimants together, the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and even Taiwan, if they'd be willing to, which they have not been, and even Indonesia, and try to present a united position to Beijing. That really worries China that might happen. They do everything they can to keep all these other guys separate and following independent courses of action. I don't see the point in all the 2 points. I don't see the point in talking about a second Cold War, because the Cold War to me means the other guy poses an existential threat to the United States, as the Soviet Union did, certainly, with its nuclear weapons. I don't think China poses that existential threat. The second thing is this current trend in Washington, more than a trend, where I've had State Department Foreign Service officers tell me, for non-attribution, they have been told they are not to refer to China doing things we don't like. They are to refer only to the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that's very fallacious. I don't know what percentage of the Chinese people support what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. A very small percentage of the population are members of the party. But I do think that the average Chinese citizen today is a hell of a lot happier than they were, say, 50 years ago. So I don't think we gain anything by this business about saying it's not China, it's the Chinese Communist Party, because I simply don't think that's accurate. That's not a very good answer, Bob, and that's about the best I can offer right now.
Dr. Cole, I've got a question from one of our DOCA members, from Marie Mugler, and that is, what is China's involvement today with North Korea?
In that same January '94 visit I mentioned, when I visited National Defense University, the full general who was in command of the place had served in Korea, the Korean War, as a private soldier. And the Lieutenant General I was with asked him that exact question. What do you think about the North Koreans? And his answer was translated very frankly, I thought, and it was, pardon my language, he said, "Goddamn North Koreans." He said, you give them what they want and they just ask for more. You don't give them what they want and they go off and sulk. So there's a real love-hate relationship there, very low on the love. They continue to see North Korea, I think, as a necessary buffer against possible South Korea. And they're willing to put up with an awful lot, but they don't like it, I don't think.
We've got a question here from Mark Lee, who said 2 years ago, Admiral Henry Harris, now Ambassador to South Korea, gave a briefing comparing U.S. Navy strength to Chinese Navy strength, and it was very frightening in terms of trends. What's your assessment of the trend of the comparative strengths of the two navies?
Well, I had the privilege of briefing Admiral Harris twice, once before he took command of the Pacific Fleet and once before he took command of Pacific Command. The numbers are very uneven. On any given day where the U.S. could have no aircraft carriers in the Western Pacific, if the one, I think George Washington, I think is home ported in Yokosuka, Japan right now, if they were in the Persian Gulf or in an overhaul, and we had a second carrier in the Persian Gulf and 2 carriers in overhaul on the West Coast, we wouldn't have a lot of forces in the Western Pacific. Plus, our numbers are way down. We have less than 300 ships now in the Navy. China's already got more than that, and they're building them very rapidly. Our ships, I think, many more of our ships are a lot more capable than Chinese counterparts. But I don't have to remind you folks that one ship can only be in one place at one time, no matter how capable it is. There's a real imbalance, and I don't think we should blame the Chinese for that as doing something evil. China is doing what every other rising major power has done throughout history. You expand your trade, you establish overseas trade depots, and you build a navy to defend the trade. And that's what China has been doing. And if we don't like it, then we ought to build a bigger navy, or more realistically, get more of our allies and friends in East Asia to cooperate more with us. Going back to your question, Bob, about this current administration's policy, I really think it's negative. I really think it's non-constructive to trash those allies whose help we need so badly, like Japan and South Korea and even Australia, his president's first day in office. I'm just not sure that's being well thought out.
What about our policy towards Taiwan and what's going on there now? Do you think we should change it, or how is it?
Well, our current U.S. policy was based on the talks that President Nixon and Henry Kissinger had in Shanghai with then Premier Zhou Enlai back in 1972. And then George H.W. Bush did when he was the de facto ambassador later in the 70s. And then, of course, in 1979, when President Carter shifted recognition of China from Taipei to Beijing, Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act. So the Taiwan Relations Act and the 3 communiques that were signed by President Nixon, President Carter, and President Reagan sort of form this structure of what's really a fragile balance among China, the United States, and Taiwan. And so we don't formally recognize.
We lost you.
So I don't think that should be changed. And I'm afraid, and I hope that all 3 capitals are fully aware of how fragile the balance is. Nobody wants to see a war, hopefully, between 2 nuclear powers. I do not think, my own personal view, is if China were to launch a military invasion of Taiwan, I think we'd have a hard time defending the island. And I'm not sure that would be a decision we should take.
We're coming up on the hour, but I would like to introduce controversy to our discussion here. I think our commander-in-chief has said that China should be held accountable for COVID-19. And he speculates that they started it and it was man-made, not a natural phenomenon. Do you have a perspective on that? And should China be held accountable for this? Is there a way to hold them accountable?
About 20 years ago, maybe longer now, a woman named Laurie Garrett, who's probably the leading expert on pandemics, wrote a long article on foreign affairs in which she said, probably every pandemic in history, going all the way back to the bubonic plague in the 13th century, started in southeastern China. And she talked about bird flows and bird migrations and so forth, and rats, and way beyond my time. I do not think it was man-made, somehow escaped.
We're losing you again.
I think it did start in central China. China didn't handle it very well, as indicated earlier. I'm not sure we've been handling it very well either.
We may have lost your last comments there, but we've come up on the hour now. And Dr. Cole, it's been a pleasure and an informative pleasure to hear your comments, detailed comments on what's going on over there. We've had briefings. You probably know Thomas Finger at Stanford University. And of course, Cynthia spoke to us recently, but yours took a different approach. So you filled in a few a few voids of knowledge there, and we appreciate your time and coming to us. As a reward for your efforts today, it's our practice to provide dinner for two. Easy when you're on the East Coast and we're here on the West Coast, but one of these days we think COVID will abate. By the way, I played golf at the course at the end of the airport this morning, and 3 jets took off at 7 a.m. That's the first that's happened in the past probably 6 months. So we are slowly getting back to normal, and with jet travel returning, perhaps you and Cynthia can come out and cash in on your growing stash of free meals at the Pacific Club, and we will tap you again to come and give us an update on what's going on. Thanks again. I'd like to call, I didn't have a chance because I got cut off today, technical errors, talk about our upcoming speakers. Will O'Neill, Mayor of Newport Beach, will speak to us on coming up on, I think, 9/11 at 11 a.m. That'll be a Zoom. And we have Senator John Morlock will come update on Thursday, September 24th. I'm working with Tom Campbell right now, trying to get him back in, and he's going to talk about the constitutional aspects of the current presidency and some of the things he's doing, and whether they're correct or not, given our Constitution. So that's what's coming up. I always like to end these with a quote, and I'm going to end with the quote that I used the last time because I found it so profound. It just kind of, but it's here's the quote. It says, "Let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world." That was said by Napoleon Bonaparte 5 years ago. I don't think Napoleon had in mind that it would take 500 years for this to come to fruition, but apparently that's what the timeline dictates, because she's in a position now to shake the world, and I'll stand by with some. So with that, hope to see you back. DOCA members, pleased you were able to join us, and we look forward to getting back. Speaking of traveling again, when DOCA can resume its normal operation of visiting these foreign military bases and U.S. embassies. I will call this meeting adjourned. Thanks very much, Dr. Cole.
Thank you all very much.